Behind the gleaming facade of one of the city's most prestigious hotels, a storm was quietly gathering, one that would shatter illusions and expose the raw truths lurking beneath polished smiles and empty courtesies. An unexpected visitor spoke in a tongue no one could grasp, bearing weight far beyond mere words, while a single figure, dismissed by all, held the power to turn the entire world inside out with nothing more than courage and conviction. This isn't just a story about language or hospitality. It's a battle for respect, identity, and justice, where the most powerful reveal themselves not through titles, but through unyielding spirit. Curious to uncover who truly holds the reins? Stay tuned, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Tell us what you think is really happening beneath the surface. Your voice matters in this unfolding truth. The Harrington Grand was the kind of hotel where everything looked like it had been hand-polished within the last hour. The chandeliers glittered with quiet menace, casting light on marble floors so clean you could see your reflection frown back at you. It was the kind of place that didn't serve breakfast, they curated it. Staff didn't speak to you, they addressed you. The clientele arrived with entourage and attitude, their luggage wheeled in silently by young men trained not to exist. This morning, however, something was off. A small woman stood at the reception desk, causing a disruption without saying a single word that anyone understood. She wasn't loud. She didn't wave her arms. But the tension radiating from her still figure was enough to fray the nerves of everyone in her vicinity. Her name was Dr. Liv Anderson, mid to late 40s, dressed in an impeccably tailored cream coat that didn't scream wealth so much as whisper power. Her icy blue eyes moved calmly between the staff as she spoke a language no one at the desk could recognize. She pointed at her printed documents. She gestured toward a diagram. Nothing worked. The junior receptionist looked like he was about to cry. Liv tried again, this time slower, enunciating every syllable with Nordic precision, as if clarity could substitute for shared vocabulary. It didn't. The staff responded with nervous glances and the kind of smiles you reserve for elderly tourists who've lost their passports. She's asking for something technical. The receptionist whispered into the phone. No, not like towels or an extra bed. I think she wants a room with some kind of special system. It looks military. On the opposite side of the lobby, seated in a low leather chair with her legs crossed like she was waiting to be worshipped, sat Laura Simmons, general manager. At 54, Laura had the confidence of someone who had risen through the ranks of the hospitality industry by stepping over anyone who hesitated. Her nails gleamed crimson against the black surface of her tablet as she scrolled through her morning schedule. She didn't need to look up. She could already sense the failure brewing. Fix it, she said without lifting her eyes. Or move her to a standard suite and comp her some fruit. By the time 3 translators had been summoned, the situation had only worsened. The first tried Mandarin. No response. The second tried Korean. Still nothing. The third, an older man in tweed, muttered in Thai and then gave up, claiming he didn't recognize the script on her document. Liv's face never betrayed anger, only an elegant sort of exhaustion. Her shoulders held the poise of someone used to being the smartest person in a room full of men who pretended not to notice. She tapped her watch. She tapped the paper again. The receptionist looked helpless. We really don't know what she's saying, he muttered, embarrassed. She could be Swedish or something. Or something, Laura echoed, finally rising from her chair with the grace of a panther that had smelled blood. Her heels clicked as she crossed the lobby, each step punctuated by mounting frustration. She leaned on the counter, lips curled in an apologetic snarl. Ma'am, if you want to stay here, you need to speak English. This is Boston. This is America. Liv said nothing, just raised her eyes. The look she gave Laura wasn't defiant. It was disappointed. That made it worse. We've wasted enough time, Laura snapped. Give her a deluxe suite, standard security, and move on. Behind her, a few guests had begun to watch, some with curiosity, others with discomfort, and a few with their phones discreetly recording. Across the lobby, next to a gleaming espresso machine, a tall black man in a white uniform quietly refilled sugar canisters. His name was Calvin Brooks, 35 years old, 6'2", broad-shouldered with sharp eyes that missed nothing. His badge said catering staff, but he was far more than that. Calvin had been at the Harrington Grand for 6 years. In those 6 years, he had become a ghost with a mop, seen but ignored. But Calvin had ears. He had listened to international guests from 5 continents, remembered accents, mirrored speech patterns. And he knew, within seconds of hearing her, that the woman wasn't speaking gibberish. She looked at the walls, ran a finger along the desk, glanced up at the sprinkler systems, and then closed the door quietly behind her. She didn't unpack. Instead, she sat on the edge of the bed, opened her tablet, and began typing furiously. Within minutes, she was canceling 2 critical virtual meetings, including one with a cybersecurity consortium out of Geneva and another with an American defense technology firm. These meetings weren't about routine lab work. They were designed to set the parameters for transnational tech-sharing agreements that had taken over a year to draft. And now, they were dissolving because no one had bothered to understand that she wasn't just a woman with a foreign accent. She was a woman carrying data too sensitive to be viewed on a public network. She had protocols. She had clearance. But no one had the patience to listen. Back in the lobby, Laura Simmons sat at her glass-topped desk with a cup of artisan coffee and a smirk. "Disruptive guests like that ruin the whole rhythm of the front desk," she said to the assistant manager, who nodded but said nothing. "If you come to America, speak English. It's not that complicated." Laura was the kind of manager who equated foreign accents with incompetence and perceived assertiveness as a threat. To her, Liv was another diva, another high-maintenance visitor using language as a power move. The fact that she'd needed multiple translators and still couldn't articulate herself only reinforced Laura's assumptions. "You saw the paper she handed over, right?" she continued. "Looked like a bomb schematic." Her voice dropped to a snide whisper. "Maybe she's trying to build a lab in a penthouse." The concierge laughed, awkward and unsure whether this was a joke or a test. Laura sipped her coffee, smug in her dismissal. Meanwhile, Calvin Brooks stood in the service hallway outside the kitchen, his earbuds in but not playing anything. He was thinking. Hard. He hadn't said a word to anyone. He hadn't even acknowledged to himself that he was about to cross a line. But something about that woman, something about her silence, was triggering a memory. It wasn't long ago that Calvin had been overseas, volunteering with a medical outreach program in Northern Europe. That's where he first picked up Norwegian, from night shift nurses and lonely patients. He didn't learn the language because he had to. He learned it because it connected him to people no one else bothered to hear. The words came back to him now in fragments, swimming under the surface of his thoughts. He looked at the clock. Still time. Maybe. Upstairs, Liv stared blankly at the email from the U.S. Department of Energy confirming cancellation. She closed the laptop and rubbed her temples. Her expression didn't change, but her fingers trembled slightly as she took a breath. She had dealt with bureaucracy, with arrogance, even with intentional obstruction. But never had she been so flatly ignored. She had handed them blueprints. She had pointed at specific components. She had even tried to pantomime electromagnetic shielding. It wasn't that they didn't understand the words. It was that they didn't care to try. She reached into her bag and pulled out her emergency contact kit. Normally, her assistant would handle rerouting. Normally, she would never be in this position. But nothing was normal today. She typed out a message to her liaison in Oslo, explaining the situation in careful detail. Her tone was factual, devoid of emotion. But the subject line, "Failure to establish secure base," said it all. She hit send and stared out the window at the city she had hoped would be her ally this week. Now it just looked foreign, alien. Across the hotel, Laura Simmons continued her tirade. "I want a note placed on her file," she told the assistant manager. "Any future reservations need to be flagged. We don't cater to paranoia." She laughed at her own comment, fully convinced of her own importance. The assistant nodded again, writing nothing. The buzz of discomfort had spread beyond the staff now. A few guests had begun whispering about the foreign woman and the commotion at check-in. Half-truths were already becoming legend. Maybe she's a spy, someone muttered near the bar. Looks like it. Cold eyes. Calvin, still in the kitchen corridor, took off his apron. He folded it neatly, placed it on a shelf, and walked toward the service elevator. No one stopped him. No one noticed. He wasn't supposed to be noticed. That had always been the unwritten rule. But today, he was going to break it. He stepped inside the elevator and pressed the button for the 17th floor. As the doors slid shut, he pulled out his phone and opened a translation app, just to double-check a few terms. Not because he didn't know them. He walked past a few closed doors, then paused outside room 1703. Inside, Dr. Liv Anderson sat at the small desk beside the window, reviewing her documents for the 5th time, highlighting sections, rewriting notes, adjusting technical phrasing that now seemed utterly useless. There was a soft knock at the door, hesitant but purposeful. She looked up. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. But then she rose and opened it slowly. Standing before her was a man in a hotel uniform, holding nothing, carrying no tray, with no towel or key card or task to hide behind. Calvin cleared his throat gently and bowed his head in a slight, respectful nod. "Unskilled Meg," he said carefully, his pronunciation precise but warm, his accent foreign yet unmistakably Norwegian. Liv blinked. She stared at him, as if he had just spoken the language of her soul aloud in a room full of silence. Her shoulders dropped a fraction. Her mouth parted, but no words came. "Jeg heter Colvin. Jeg jobber her," he continued, his tone low and calm. "Kan jeg hjelpe deg?" Liv finally responded, her Norwegian fluent and fluid, tinged with relief, so profound it nearly collapsed her entire frame. They spoke quickly, exchanging only the most urgent information. Calvin asked what she needed. Liv explained the security requirements. She clarified the nature of her assignment, not in full detail, but enough for him to understand this was more than a hotel room. It was a functional base for sensitive work. She needed electromagnetic shielding, localized server access, and preferably an isolated signal environment. Calvin nodded, understanding more than he let on. "Venter," he said. "Jeg kommer tilbake." Then, without waiting for permission, he turned and walked back toward the elevator. Downstairs, Laura Simmons had escalated. Her voice echoed through the high-ceilinged lobby, loud enough that even guests on the far side of the lounge began to turn their heads. "I don't care if she's royalty," Laura snapped. "If she wants to stay here, she needs to follow the rules like everyone else. We operate in English. We bill in dollars. We don't cater to riddles and codes and military-level drama." She was standing now, pacing near the front desk, her heels clacking aggressively against the marble floor Calvin had polished that morning. The staff watched her carefully, their eyes darting between her face and the growing group of onlookers who were pretending not to stare. One guest, seated near the bar, whispered to his partner, "Is that about the foreign woman?" His partner nodded. "The one with the folder?" "Yeah. She's been here all morning. I heard she doesn't speak a word of English." Another guest chimed in. "Honestly, what kind of person shows up at a hotel like this without knowing the language? Entitled much." The murmurs grew louder and Laura, feeding off the energy, doubled down. "If she's got demands, she can book the Ritz. We don't run a military base. We're a hotel. We offer comfort, not Cold War bunkers." The concierge tried to interrupt. "Ma'am, maybe we should lower our voices. There are guests listening." Laura turned on him. "Let them listen. Let everyone hear. I've had enough of this nonsense. She's not our only guest, you know. We can't shut down the lobby because someone refuses to speak English. This is America. This is Boston. This is my hotel." Back on the 17th floor, Liv stood in the doorway, watching the hallway Calvin had disappeared into. She didn't dare hope too much, but the crack in the wall had appeared. Someone had spoken her language. Someone had listened. Downstairs, Calvin exited the elevator and moved quickly through the side hallways to avoid Laura's line of sight. He made his way into the back office, where tech equipment for conferences was stored. He wasn't authorized to enter, but he had cleaned the room enough to know where the key was hidden. Within minutes, he had gathered a portable signal shield unit, a basic server kit, and a grounding mat. It wasn't perfect, but it would give Liv enough to stabilize her connection and buy time. When he returned to the front desk to log the equipment, Laura spotted him. "Where do you think you're going with that?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Calvin paused. "A guest requested a quiet workstation. IT approved it." "Which guest?" "Dr. Anderson." Laura stepped closer. "Are you kidding me?" she scoffed. "She's got you running errands now?" "What did she do? Blink twice in Morse code?" She asked in Norwegian. Calvin replied simply. That caught Laura off guard. "What?" "She's Norwegian. She needed a secure space to conduct work. I speak the language." I translated. Laura stared at him as if he had just revealed he was an alien. "You're a waiter," she said flatly. "You don't translate. You serve coffee." Calvin didn't flinch. "Today, I did both." Laura's expression hardened. "You're out of line." "Maybe," he said. "But at least I know what language our guest speaks." Guests nearby were no longer pretending not to listen. A young woman near the lobby fireplace pulled out her phone, subtly recording. A man near the reception desk shook his head, whispering. Unbelievable. Laura sensed the shift. Her posture stiffened. His voice had not been loud, but it carried a calm clarity that sliced through the tension like a scalpel. "I believe she's speaking Norwegian," Calvin had said, without flinching. He had said it not as a guess, not as a suggestion, but as a certainty. Laura had turned slowly, one brow arched, her mouth curling into a sarcastic smile that barely disguised her condescension. "Oh? And what are you now, a language specialist?" Her tone was sharp, a dagger wrapped in velvet. Calvin didn't rise to the bait. "No, ma'am," he replied, respectful but steady. "But I do speak Norwegian. I volunteered with a European health project in Oslo for 2 years. I'd like to try." "Let me get this straight," Laura said, turning slightly to ensure the watching guests caught every word. "We paid 3 professional translators, and none of them could make sense of her, but now our waiter thinks he's the secret sauce." There were a few quiet laughs from staff members who didn't realize which way the wind was about to shift. Calvin didn't blink. "Ma'am, I just want to help the guest." "Fine," Laura said with a sigh of theatrical exhaustion. "Go ahead, let's all watch the coffee guy save the day." She folded her arms, fully expecting him to embarrass himself. Calvin walked around the reception desk, the same route he took every morning on his way to deliver fruit plates and cappuccinos. Only now he was crossing into a space reserved for managers, concierges, and authority. Every step was deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant, but with a kind of quiet confidence that forced the room to pause. He approached the elevator, requested access to the 17th floor, and disappeared behind the golden doors with a quiet whoosh. Laura smirked and turned to her staff. "This'll be good." Upstairs, Liv sat cross-legged on the floor of her suite, her laptop balanced on one knee, papers spread around her in a wide arc of organized chaos. She was trying to simulate the secure connection protocols using only the equipment Calvin had brought earlier, which, while limited, had at least bought her a few options. The server was booted, the shielding mat was active, and yet she knew she had less than an hour before she had to make a final call to abort the entire mission. She didn't want to, but there were too many layers of risk. She couldn't afford a data leak. A knock came at the door, soft but firm. Liv rose with care, her spine tight with uncertainty. She opened the door cautiously and saw Calvin standing there, not with more equipment, not with an apology, but with intention. "Unskilled Meg," he said gently, his Oslo-accented Norwegian sounding like a lifeline in a storm. "Mitt navn er Colvin. Jeg jobber her. Jeg kan hjelpe." Liv stared at him, stunned. Her mouth opened, but no sound came at first. Then softly she replied, "Du snakker norsk?" The words carried both disbelief and relief. "Ja, flyte nok," Calvin replied with a modest shrug. "Jeg hørte deg nede. Jeg beklager. Ingen forsto." Liv let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For the first time since she arrived, her shoulders dropped. Her posture softened. Her eyes, previously narrowed with caution and weariness, widened with cautious hope. "Tak," she said, her voice thick. "Tusen takk." They spoke for several minutes, and Liv explained the nature of her work in brief, carefully choosing what to reveal, but offering enough to make it clear that she was not just a tourist with a Wi-Fi issue. She needed a secure location to access highly classified schematics tied to a multinational infrastructure upgrade program. It wasn't espionage, but it was sensitive enough that even hotel Wi-Fi could not be trusted. Calvin listened attentively, nodding in understanding, occasionally asking for clarification in Norwegian, but never interrupting. He let her speak. He let her be heard. When she was finished, he said, "I think I can help. Let me make a few calls. I can get access to the executive conference suite. It's not booked until tomorrow. It has reinforced walls and a wired server node. I can bring up a hardwired terminal if that helps." Liv blinked, visibly moved. "You would do that?" "I already did," Calvin said with a small smile. "Just needed to confirm it's what you needed before setting it up." Liv didn't respond right away. Instead, she walked over to her folder, retrieved one of the blueprints, and handed it to him. Calvin glanced at it, nodded in comprehension, and said, "Let's get to work." Back in the lobby, Laura was holding court, recounting past instances where she had to rescue the hotel from difficult guests. She was so lost in her monologue that she didn't notice the elevator open. When Calvin stepped out, Laura turned toward him with mock applause. "Did she knight you? You two exchanged recipes." Calvin ignored the sarcasm and simply said, "She's Norwegian. She's a scientist under international security protocol. She needed a secure room for encrypted access. I'm setting her up in the executive suite." Laura blinked, measured resolve. People moved aside without being told. Even the concierge, usually quick to delegate, simply nodded in acknowledgement and looked away. Calvin crossed the floor and approached the front desk, where the remaining translators stood awkwardly with clipboards in hand. One of them was nervously scrolling through his phone, as if looking up Norwegian phrases belatedly. Another was packing up, embarrassed by his earlier confident claims. Laura Simmons stood rigid behind the counter, arms folded tight across her chest, trying to maintain an expression of authority. But authority had already shifted. Calvin glanced at the staff. "I've spoken with Dr. Anderson. She's confirmed what she needs, a private space with isolated signal shielding, wired access, and sound suppression. She's been trying to communicate that since this morning." A beat of silence passed, and Laura's eyebrows lifted with forced amusement. "And she told you this in what fluent emoji?" she said with a scoff. Calvin ignored her. "She's using the temporary setup we provided, but it's not sufficient for the type of data she needs to access. She's coordinating with multiple governments on infrastructure protocols related to transnational security." She wasn't being difficult. She was being careful. Murmurs spread through the small crowd of onlookers. The guest by the fireplace whispered, "Wait, is she some kind of official?" Calvin nodded. "She didn't say more than what was necessary, but I know discretion when I see it." He turned slightly and gestured toward the translators. "Thanks for your time. Your services won't be needed anymore." The three professionals glanced at each other, nodded sheepishly, and backed away. One of them, red-faced, muttered, "Guess we should have tried Scandinavian." Laura leaned forward on the counter, her voice lowered but sharp. "Let me get this straight, Brooks. You've bypassed protocol, activated a restricted executive suite, and are speaking on behalf of a guest with no written authority." Calvin met her eyes. "I activated the suite with Marcus's code, and I'm relaying her needs because I'm the only one in this building who bothered to understand her." The guests in the lobby were no longer whispering. They were openly watching. Phones were still out. The air vibrated with a quiet shift in power, the kind that doesn't need declarations because it's already been felt. Laura's lips tightened. "What makes you think you're qualified to be her interpreter?" Calvin glanced around the lobby, then back at her. "Because I studied Norwegian for fun," he said, and the simplicity of the sentence disarmed the room. "Because I cared enough to learn. Not for a job, not for a test, just because I wanted to know how other people see the world." He paused, then added, "And I listened when no one else would." On the 17th floor, Liv Anderson finished uploading the critical documents to her team's secured portal. The signal was finally stable, thanks to the conference suite Calvin had arranged. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The panic in her chest had settled, replaced by cautious optimism. She stood and stretched, then walked slowly toward the glass wall that overlooked the city. Her breath fogged faintly against the window. For a brief moment, she saw a version of herself reflected back, one that had been helpless just hours ago, dismissed and misunderstood. But now, that version was starting to fade. She turned and walked toward the elevator. Downstairs, Calvin remained calm as Laura tried to salvage her pride. "You really expect me to believe you just happened to know Norwegian," she said, her voice dripping with disbelief. "I do," Calvin replied. "I worked in Oslo. I volunteered in Sognsvann. I stayed with a host family who taught me more than textbooks ever could. Language isn't just words, it's context. It's rhythm. I didn't just learn what she was saying. I understood what she meant." That last line landed harder than any insult Laura had thrown all day. Even the junior receptionist, who had been silently watching the whole ordeal, looked away, embarrassed for her. Laura tried one last time to regain control. "This is highly irregular," she said. "You're a waiter, not an ambassador." "And she's not just a guest," Calvin responded. "She's a partner." Or she was. As if summoned by the momentum of that sentence, the elevator chimed and opened. Liv Anderson stepped out. She had changed jackets, now wearing a darker wool coat, her hair tied back in a neat bun. She looked composed, not theatrical, but the shift in her presence was immediate. The guests who had seen her only as a confused foreigner now saw something else, someone precise, measured, and powerful. Liv walked directly toward the reception desk, ignoring Laura completely. She stopped beside Calvin and said something in Norwegian with calm confidence. Calvin responded without hesitation, and they exchanged a few lines of quiet dialogue that no one else could follow. Then Liv turned to the rest of the lobby, scanning the room, her expression unreadable. She opened her leather folio and pulled out a hotel feedback card. She took a pen from a counter and began to write. Laura watched uneasy. Calvin stood by, ready but unintrusive. When Liv finished, she folded the card and handed it to the junior receptionist. Then, with a final glance at Calvin, she said something else in Norwegian, slower this time, with warmth behind it. Liv Anderson had returned to the executive suite after handing off her handwritten note, but only briefly. Now, she emerged again, less a guest, more a presence. There was a shift in the way she carried herself, the way she scanned the room, the way her quiet confidence filled space. As she crossed the lobby, the junior receptionist instinctively straightened up. Calvin looked over, but remained still, allowing her to take the lead. Laura, seeing her return, forced a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Back again," she said, folding her arms like a judge preparing to dismiss a petty case. Liv didn't respond right away. She turned slightly, taking in the staff, the translators still hovering near the coffee bar, and the guests pretending not to stare. Then she looked directly at Laura, her expression unreadable but sharp. "Miss Simmons," she said, and the words came in perfect, fluent English. Her tone clipped with European precision. "You've made quite an impression today." The voice didn't match the woman Laura thought she'd been mocking. There was no trace of confusion or meekness. This wasn't a foreigner fumbling with syntax. This was a professional measuring each word like data. "Oh," Laura said, taken aback but trying not to show it. "So you do speak English?" Liv tilted her head. "I speak 6 languages, actually, English included. But I find silence reveals far more about a person's character than conversation." A few guests near the lounge audibly gasped. One man near the elevator chuckled under his breath. Calvin kept his eyes steady, watching Laura's face harden. "Then why didn't you?" Laura began, but Liv cut in. "Why didn't I make your job easier? Why didn't I rescue you from your own impatience and assumptions?" She took a step closer. "Because it is not my job to compensate for your lack of curiosity, nor your unwillingness to listen." Laura's cheeks reddened as she shifted her weight. You were disruptive. You confused the staff. Liv raised an eyebrow. I handed your staff a document, printed in English and Norwegian, clearly outlining my reservation, the technical requirements for my work, and the authorization code from your regional headquarters. Your staff ignored it. You called me a problem. Your translators gave up. Your employees laughed. And your guests watched as you publicly mocked someone you didn't understand. Her voice wasn't loud, but it rang through the lobby like a verdict. Laura tried again. Look, maybe this is all just. Liv reached into her folio and pulled out her phone. I've recorded every conversation since my arrival. Not because I intended to escalate this, but because I know how quickly truth is rewritten in places like this. She tapped the screen. You see, I'm not just here on business. I'm here representing the Intergovernmental Science Innovation Council. I'm the project coordinator overseeing several $1 billion in grant allocations tied to global infrastructure security. This hotel was selected for its reputation as a potential long-term partner in a series of international conferences. A reputation that is now complicated. The silence that followed was explosive. Calvin remained motionless, but inside, he could feel every molecule in the air shift as the weight of Liv's identity came crashing down upon every assumption Laura had made. The guests were no longer whispering. They were openly staring, mouths slightly agape, phones quietly capturing video, unsure if this was justice or diplomacy at work. Laura looked pale now, her bravado slipping. I wasn't aware, she began, but Liv raised a hand, commanding silence. No, you weren't. You weren't aware because you didn't ask. You weren't aware because you dismissed me. Because my accent didn't meet your standard. Because I didn't beg in your language. But what you were aware of was your own discomfort, and you projected that onto me. You turned your ignorance into my burden. Laura's voice caught. This doesn't have to go any further. Maybe we can find a resolution. Liv nodded slowly. Oh, I agree. But resolution doesn't begin with apologies after exposure. It begins with recognition, with consequence, with change. Calvin stepped forward slightly, not to interrupt, but to show solidarity. Liv glanced at him and softened. This gentleman, she said, motioning to Calvin, was the only person who saw me as a human being first. Not a problem, not an inconvenience, but a person with a need. And he acted. Quietly, effectively, respectfully. I hope your organization learns to value people like him more than the ones who carry titles and shame them. Laura stood still, hands trembling faintly at her sides. She was no longer the queen of this space. She was a figure caught in the spotlight of her own negligence. Liv looked around at the staff, at the manager, and finally at the crowd. I don't believe in destroying people, she said quietly. But I do believe in accountability. Calvin glanced sideways only once, unsure whether to break the silence or let it linger. He had never expected to be pulled into anything remotely like this when he showed up for his morning shift. He had wiped down counters, arranged silverware, and stocked coffee capsules as he always did. But now he had been thrust into something far bigger than anything he could have imagined. As they reached the courtyard center, Liv paused, turning toward him with a composed expression that no longer held the guarded edge it once had. Her voice was quiet but unmistakably clear. What's your full name? Calvin straightened his spine instinctively, not out of fear, but respect. Calvin Brooks, ma'am. Liv nodded. I thought so, she replied, pulling her phone from her coat pocket. When you brought me the equipment earlier, I used the brief time you were gone to look into your staff portal. It wasn't locked. I imagine they assumed I couldn't read it. Calvin said nothing. Liv tapped her screen and then looked up at him. You attended the University of Massachusetts, Department of Linguistics. Full academic scholarship. GPA 3.9. Fluency in Norwegian, Spanish, and Intermediate Mandarin. Internship in Geneva at the World Language Institute. But you left in your third year. No disciplinary record. No academic issue. Just gone. Calvin's throat felt suddenly dry. He hadn't expected her to see him like that. Not fully. Not truthfully. He forced a breath through his nose. My mother was diagnosed with late-stage lymphoma, he said, voice low. My younger sister had just turned 15. There wasn't anyone else. I dropped out, came home, took the first job I could find. One day became 1 year, then another. Liv didn't react with pity. There was no soft gasp, no sympathetic tilt to the head. Instead, there was understanding. Real, grounded, intelligent understanding. You never stopped learning, she said. No, he replied. I couldn't afford to. She nodded slowly. Most people in your position would have let it all slip away. But you didn't. You turned waiting tables into cultural immersion. You learned language the way it's meant to be learned. Through people. Through struggle. Through care. Calvin shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. Liv put away her phone and stepped forward, her tone shifting from observant to purposeful. I want to offer you something. It's not charity. It's not a favor. It's recognition. Calvin's brow furrowed slightly. Liv continued. I oversee the Intergovernmental Science Innovation Council's American branch. Part of my role involves expanding international engagement programs. We need people who can speak across cultures, who can see past the obvious and act when no one else will. We need people like you. Calvin blinked. You want me to? Come work for us, Liv said firmly. Start as coordinator of intercultural affairs. Help us build bridges with communities and talent that are often overlooked. The position is salaried, comes with benefits, and includes a return-to-school grant if you choose to finish your degree. You wouldn't be starting over. You'd be continuing what you've already begun. The words hit like thunder without noise. Calvin had imagined many futures in his life. He had once dreamed of teaching, of interpreting for diplomats, of shaping programs that valued language as more than communication. But those dreams had faded under bills, illness, and years of being invisible behind a serving tray. He had never expected an opportunity like this to come not from an application or a recruiter, but from a moment of decency that had simply felt like the right thing to do. Why me? He asked softly. Because you didn't wait for permission, Liv replied. You didn't ask whether it was your role. You saw someone being silenced and chose to listen. That's leadership, and that's exactly what I want on my team. Calvin turned his gaze toward the garden wall, exhaling deeply, as if releasing a decade of tension in one breath. I'd have to give notice, he said, half smiling. Liv smiled back. I think that'll be handled soon enough. They both turned their heads as the side door to the courtyard creaked open. Marcus Johnson, the senior concierge, and one of the only other black employees in a leadership role at the hotel, walked toward them with slow, measured steps. He looked from Calvin to Liv, then nodded slightly. You made the right call, Marcus said to Calvin. They're scrambling up there. Laura's been pulled into an emergency call with corporate. It's not looking good for her. Calvin raised an eyebrow. You think they'll let her go? Marcus shrugged. Depends on how much damage control they're willing to do. But let's just say her aura of untouchable power is fading fast. Liv looked at Marcus with professional curiosity. You stayed quiet in the lobby. Marcus nodded. Sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is wait for the right moment. I knew if I stepped in too soon, it would become about me. But when Calvin acted, that was authentic. And authenticity is unstoppable. Liv extended a hand. Thank you for standing by him. Marcus shook it. He earned that himself. Calvin looked at both of them, the reality of the day sinking in like ink into paper. Hours ago, he had been stocking creamers. The shockwave of the morning's events had rippled far beyond the hotel's marble walls, reaching ears and eyes in boardrooms and living rooms alike, reshaping reputations overnight. Laura was seated behind her desk, head in her hands, attempting to gather her thoughts as her phone rang incessantly. The first few calls were from the hotel's corporate office, urgent, sharp voices demanding immediate answers, explanations for what was rapidly becoming a PR disaster. Each ring was a blow, her hands trembling as she fumbled to answer. Simmons, she whispered into the phone, barely able to mask her panic. Yes, I understand. I'm taking steps. Her voice cracked under the pressure. The CEO's tone was unforgiving. You allowed a security breach. a diplomatic incident, and you humiliated a valued guest on camera. This is unacceptable. You are suspended pending investigation. Pack your things and leave the premises immediately." The words struck her like a verdict from a judge she thought she controlled. Her lips parted, but no protest came. She knew the damage was done. Meanwhile, across the lobby, hotel guests and staff were glued to their phones. Viral clips had been circulating on social media for hours. The videos showed Laura's earlier tirades, the translator's failures, Calvin's intervention, and most damning of all, the condescending way Laura dismissed Liv Anderson's needs. Hashtags like #HarringtonFail and #RespectIsMandatory trended within the city by midday, spreading to national news feeds. The video was replayed countless times, dissected by commentators who framed the story as a cautionary tale of arrogance and prejudice in luxury hospitality. Corporate partners, long reliant on the Harrington Grand's reputation as a safe and welcoming venue, began reconsidering their contracts. The American Science Association, a key collaborator for numerous conferences, issued a formal statement expressing concern over the incident and temporarily suspending their bookings. Several multinational firms publicly distanced themselves from the hotel until an internal review was completed. The lobby, once a place of polished professionalism, had become a theater of reckoning. Calvin, now officially off the clock, stood with Marcus Johnson near the reception area. Marcus shook his head. "I've never seen anything like this," he said. Laura's empire just crumbled in a matter of hours. Calvin exhaled. Maybe this is what it takes to change things. The junior receptionist approached quietly. "Is it true?" he asked. "Is she really suspended?" Marcus nodded. "Yes. And it's only the beginning." Guests still whispered among themselves, many expressing admiration for Calvin and Liv. Some even approached staff to apologize for earlier skepticism. The general mood had flipped. Respect was now being demanded, and rightly so. Meanwhile, Laura gathered her belongings, her steps heavy and slow. She avoided eye contact, hearing whispers as she passed, words like disgrace and fallen hanging in the air. As she exited the building, the doors closing behind her felt less like a passage and more like a curtain falling on her career. In the days that followed, the media coverage intensified. Interviews with Liv Anderson highlighted her grace and professionalism amid adversity. Calvin Brooks was praised as a hero who bridged cultures and stood up for dignity. The hotel's management faced intense scrutiny, with calls for widespread reforms. Behind the scenes, company executives met urgently, drafting new policies aimed at inclusivity, cultural sensitivity, and accountability. What had started as a single misunderstanding had sparked a movement within the hospitality industry. Laura's suspension became permanent termination weeks later. The decision was unanimous. No appeals, no second chances. The message was clear. Prejudice and arrogance had no place in the company's future. For Laura, the loss was more than professional. It was personal. Her name became associated with a cautionary tale of hubris. Her reputation tarnished beyond repair, job offers ceased. She retreated from the public eye, her social circles shrinking with each passing day. But the story wasn't just about downfall. Every morning, as he walked past the polished marble floors where he had once felt invisible, Calvin felt the weight of his journey, from a young man who left college to care for his family, to a respected professional shaping international collaboration. Liv Anderson's influence was present everywhere. Her decision to recognize Calvin's worth had ignited a transformation not only for him, but for the Harrington Grand and beyond. Together, they had developed programs to train staff in cultural competence, ensuring that no guest would again be dismissed for their accent or appearance. Calvin's office was a hub of activity. Maps of global linguistic communities decorated the walls. Charts detailed outreach initiatives, scholarship programs, and partnerships with local universities. Today, he was preparing for a conference that would bring together international delegates, many from communities historically overlooked. One project was especially close to his heart, a mentorship program aimed at young immigrants and minorities who had faced barriers similar to those he had overcome. As he checked his schedule, Marcus Johnson entered the room with a broad smile. "The meeting with the Norwegian delegation is confirmed for 3 o'clock," Marcus announced. "They're eager to see the progress on the community engagement project." Calvin nodded, energized. "Good. Let's make sure everything is ready. Liv's going to be proud." The phone buzzed with an incoming message from Liv herself, a brief note expressing gratitude and excitement about the upcoming partnership. Calvin smiled, feeling the connection that had grown stronger over the months. Meanwhile, across town, the shadow of the past lingered in a small, dimly lit apartment where Laura Simmons sat alone, flipping through newspapers, searching for any sign of opportunity. Her dismissal from the Harrington Grand had become national news, a cautionary tale of how arrogance and prejudice could destroy even the most secure careers. Job applications went unanswered. Former colleagues avoided her calls. Even her family's support waned, unable to reconcile the public figure she had been with the person revealed by the scandal. Social media was relentless, replaying clips of her tirade, turning her into a symbol of what needed to change in the hospitality industry and beyond. Yet, amid the isolation, Laura had moments of reflection. She recognized the magnitude of her mistakes, the cost of ignoring humanity in favor of authority. Though she longed for redemption, the path ahead was uncertain, and the echoes of the past would follow her for years to come. Back at the Harrington Grand, the air had shifted permanently. The hotel embraced its role as a model for inclusion and respect. Liv Anderson became a regular guest, her presence a symbol of the new era. She also became a minority investor in the hotel, ensuring that changes weren't temporary but deeply rooted. Together with Calvin, she championed initiatives that bridged divides, cultivated understanding, and celebrated diversity. During a lunch at their favorite Norwegian restaurant, Liv reflected aloud on the journey. "What makes me most proud," she said, "is that this isn't just about me or Calvin. It's about proving that when we value true diversity, everyone wins." Calvin nodded, remembering the day they first met in that hotel lobby. "I used to think my education and skills didn't matter because no one saw them. But the problem was never with me." Liv smiled softly. "And what about Laura?" Calvin asked. "She's working retail now," Liv replied without bitterness. "I hope she's learned about respect and humility. True justice isn't about destruction, it's about creating opportunities for growth." As they finished their meal, Calvin received an update on a young Latina intern he had recently mentored, a former hotel maid fluent in 4 languages, overlooked until Calvin's intervention. "She's thriving beyond all expectations," he said, proud. Liv laughed. "Just as you predicted." In the quiet moments that followed, Calvin gazed out the window at the city skyline, a panorama that once seemed unreachable, but now felt like home. The journey from invisibility to influence had been long and difficult, but it had proven that courage, dignity, and recognition could rewrite the rules. Months had passed since the Harrington Grand's lobby had witnessed the confrontation that would change everything. The marble floors that once echoed with footsteps of entitlement now hummed quietly beneath the determined strides of staff members newly trained in empathy and cultural sensitivity. The hotel's management had undergone a complete overhaul. New faces replaced the old guard, and diversity was no longer an afterthought, but a foundational value. As part of this transformation, Liv Anderson's role had expanded beyond that of a guest or partner. She had become a minority investor in the Harrington Grand. Her investment was more than financial. It was a commitment to the hotel's future as a beacon of inclusivity and respect. With Calvin Brooks by her side, she helped implement programs that bridged cultures and brought unheard voices to the forefront. Calvin's position as coordinator of intercultural affairs had blossomed into a leadership role that shaped policy and practice not only at the hotel, but across affiliated organizations worldwide. His mentorship programs flourished, giving young immigrants and minorities pathways to careers they had once thought impossible. Meanwhile, Laura Simmons lived a life far removed from the luxury she once commanded. Her name had become synonymous with prejudice and arrogance in hospitality circles, a cautionary tale shared in industry seminars about the cost of closed-mindedness. repeated job applications went unanswered, and her social circle diminished. Yet, amidst the fallout, Laura's story served as a powerful lesson, a stark contrast to the growth and change that Calvin and Liv represented. One quiet afternoon, Calvin received a letter hand-delivered to the office by a courier. The envelope was heavy cream-colored and embossed with elegant script. Inside was a simple note from Liv. "Calvin," it read, "your courage to step forward and listen gave me the strength to stand taller than I ever thought possible. Your story helped me feel seen too. Thank you for being the light when all else was dark." Calvin read the words twice, feeling a warmth that had little to do with the afternoon sun filtering through the office windows. It was a reminder that true strength wasn't measured in titles or accolades, but in the quiet decisions to be visible, to speak, and to act when invisibility was the easier path. The Harrington Grand now stood as a testament to what could happen when institutions embraced change rather than resisted it. The hotel had transformed from a symbol of exclusion to a model of hospitality, where every guest and employee was valued for their whole personhood. Across the city, stories like Calvin's and Liv's inspired countless others. Stories of resilience, recognition, and revolution born not from conflict, but from dignity and mutual respect. As Calvin looked out at the city skyline from his office on the 17th floor, he reflected on the journey from invisibility to impact. The woman who once sat silently, misunderstood in a cold hotel room, had become his partner in change. The man who once moved unnoticed behind trays and tables now led initiatives that shaped futures. And the man who had tried so hard to survive had learned that survival was just the beginning. True victory lay in thriving, in building, in bridging, and in believing that no one should be invisible when they dare to step into the light. This was the legacy of the Harrington Grand, a legacy written by those who refused to be silenced, who chose courage over comfort, and who proved that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone tried to ignore. The end was not about destruction or revenge. It was about creation, the creation of a new standard, a new way forward, where respect was the currency and dignity the foundation. In the quiet moments, beyond the cameras and headlines, Calvin knew that the Real work was only just beginning. But for now, they had won something far greater than a contract or a job. They had won the truth of their worth. And in that truth lay a light no shadow could ever extinguish. The end. If you enjoyed this story of courage and transformation, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to light. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of the story resonated with you the most? Where are you watching from? Share your comments below and join the conversation. Your voice matters, and together we can keep spreading messages of hope and strength.